So we've dealt so much about security. It seems like between chapter 19, what are we looking at? Four, maybe a little more than four chapters just dealing with security. And last week we talked a bit about security from different standpoints, but we were looking at it from specifically the mobile device security. And everything security has been from all the way back to module 11. Even when we were dealing with the initial install, we were addressing security concerns. We talked about doing updates. Updates are primarily security related. So when we're dealing with the OS, there's so much about the OS now that is focused on security. Keeping what you have secure in a digital form. So a lot of what we'll deal with today, you've dealt with either in the past or we've talked about maybe in a different context, but most of it will be a been there, done that kind of thing. So they've got specific outcomes that they look at, but we're going to talk about the network security and securing your system over a network. Now, it could be a mobile device like we were talking about last week, but in this context, we're talking about chapter 19, they're primarily focused on client-server networks and not necessarily mobile or non-mobile devices. We're just looking at it from some form of LAN, WAN, whatever it may be. And they said we deal with that term a lot. She loves using it in these in the books that she writes. SOHO routers, which essentially is your home office. Okay. So jump into it. And we're going to talk about making sure that workstations themselves or anything, any IoT device, whatever it may be, that's connected to the network is secure over the network. So some of the research that I've been doing the last 2-3 months has dealt with IoT devices, and actually working on a paper right now on security solutions in the IoT domain. Now, there are so many ways that we can go about securing the devices, but we talked about it last week, week before. The more we secure a system, the more levels of security that we implement, the more comprehensive the level of security that we implement, the more difficult we're making it for intruders to access our systems. But we're also making it oftentimes more difficult for our traditional users, the people that we intend on getting access, and make it a little more cumbersome or just downright difficult in some instances for them to do what they need to do. So it's a catch-22. No matter how hard we try, we have some kind of cost associated with these security efforts. So here we're going to talk mainly about the workstation itself. So what are the primary ways that we use the network? Well, most people, they're using the network to connect to the internet, and they're using it via an email application or a browser. When you really think about it, most of what you do on the computer is either through a specific application or some browser. What we're doing right now is a combination of two, using Zoom, which is a standalone application, but we're also using whatever browser we're using to connect to Canvas. So both of those things have live connections to the network, and we've got to worry about securing both of them individually. So the browser itself, mentioned it in the past, but the browser itself has updates associated with it, just like our operating system gets regular updates, the browser does as well. Because the same things that they're trying to do to get into our OS, they're trying to do the same things to get into our computer through the browser. Now, the browser essentially, they're going to try a little bit harder to get into your browser than they will any other way of getting in. Well, aside from the catfishing we talked about last week, or week before last. Now, the browser, just by going to the website, you set up this back and forth to where you're saying, hey, send me all the files I need to view your web page. And we literally have to have a certain degree of trust that our browser is going to protect us. Now, it's not going to protect us 100% by default. We've got to go in and manually change some settings. We do that traditionally in Chrome. Over on the right side, you see it's the ellipsis, the three little dots, but they're vertical. And when you click on that, see it over here on mine, come down and we go to settings, it'll pop open a new tab, and then we can go in and change whatever the settings are. They want you to go ahead and turn on sync. I'll turn on sync in certain scenarios, but by default, that's not going to happen. We'll talk about why. So I think I mentioned it in the past that there was an individual that was teaching in the same classroom that I was teaching in, logging into the same system that I logged in, but there were no individual accounts. It was just an admin account. And when I came in, I would log in. I was done. I would sign out, log out. The other individual would come in, log in, sign in. For whatever reason, they just didn't feel the need to sign out of their Google when they left. Didn't even sign out of the computer. So when I came back in, Google still connected in that individual's account. And it was set up to sync all passwords, sync everything. And absolutely anything you could think of associated with that individual's day-to-day financial life was listed right there, and all the passwords that were saved, because since it was wide open and signed in, I could see all the passwords that were saved, which told me all the accounts that I could potentially go access. So if there's that much stuff that's being saved to a third-party entity, well, essentially through the browser,
You got to take a lot of care and caution in how you interact with it and what you save there, because it doesn't take much to slip up and oops,
somebody had access to my system and I didn't even realize I left it open. So there were things that we talked about before relative to physical security and those protocols we need to follow, that when you walk away from your computer, you either manually log out right then, or you have it set to automatically lock after a specific time frame of inactivity. After a certain duration of inactivity, that's okay, but it's not good enough. We need to be real proactive and log out when we walk away, because you never know what's going to happen in just a matter of minutes when you walk away to go get a cup of coffee, go to the restroom, go over to somebody's office, ask them a question. You come back and you don't even know things have happened, and that physical access can be significantly compromising. So Edge, we do the same thing, but we do that through the application since it is part of Windows now. We can go in and change the settings in there, much like we would do in Google Chrome. Things that we would want to think about: plugins, extensions, pop-ups, allowing scripting, things like that. Allow the computer to go ahead and do things without letting you know first. So I love the concept of trust but verify. And sadly, if you don't set this up, if you don't configure it correctly, you're trusting and you're not even bothering to verify, because you just allow the browser to go do whatever it feels like doing, or whatever it's automatically defaulted set to do. So there are certain file extensions that we don't want to have run. I don't want .exe files running unless I manually allow it to happen, ever. And the only things could be things that I've installed, and by installing them, I've authorized them to run. And they traditionally would either run on startup, or they would run on the initialization when I click on the link to manually run them. So there's things that we got to take into consideration. Saving passwords to a browser, not a good idea at all. Cookies are not that big a deal anymore. A lot of times people say, oh, just don't allow cookies. Well, you can allow cookies because it's minimally intrusive. All it is a flat file that exists on a specific folder, and I shouldn't say a flat file, it's multiple flat files, and each one is created by the website, whatever website you're dealing with. But the thing is, the cookie file created by Google is accessible to any other website, not just Google websites. So it's publicly accessible. You just got to be cautious about what's going in there. Now, is it a good idea to click that little checkbox that says, remember me? Say I go to a website,
or I log into an app and it takes username, password
to authenticate who you are. Could be your bank, your insurance company, whatever. A lot of times you see those little check boxes that says, remember me. Now the remember you traditionally just remembers your username. And then you have to manually enter the password. Now, by saying remember me, I'm making it easier on myself, so I don't have to type that username in every time. But by saying remember me, I'm telling somebody, if they can see my computer, if they access my computer, I'm telling them what my username is. Now all they got to worry about is my password. Unless I've got a two-factor authentication set up. So there's things that we've got to go through and do, settings relative to pop-ups, cookies. You may want to clear your browser history so that somebody doesn't know where you've gone. Now, all too often, we hear about on the news, somebody's been arrested. And the charges were brought because law enforcement got their browsing history. Now that's used against them. All for that. They were doing something they shouldn't have been doing, and there's some evidence that's a great thing. Now, I don't know how much that could be used against you. If you weren't doing anything wrong, nothing was illegal, nothing was inappropriate, I don't know what they could use your browsing history to access to do, other than they would know, oh, they went to their bank. Now I know where they have a bank at. So I can maybe spoof them with an email from their bank. That's a possibility, or some website that they've interacted with. So that's possible. A lot of times we can go set privacy settings and say, look, don't keep track of where I've gone. I don't want any record of where I've been, because it's nobody else's business. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not still available one way or another, but it's not very easily available. There's still ways to go about getting your history. It may not be on the local machine, but it's technically still available on the ISP domain. So let's say whatever we do through a browser from our office or from our home, when we think about how these systems are communicating over the network, we're sending packets back and forth between the client and the server. And these packets are running through routers, switches, hubs, a multitude of them, not just one or two. And at each level along the way, depending on what device it is that it's having to go through, those packets are being looked at to find out where's this thing coming from and where's it going. So it's got that information about the origin and the destination. And there's a record of that as you pass through it, much like the way we've got SunPass today. These packets can be tracked to see, all right, here's packets going to this domain, where they come from. Who was this person talking to? So it's not just a local concept. And this do not track is on the local device, but that data exists outside our device as well, if somebody wanted to access it bad enough. So there's things that we can do is to create secure connections to these websites so that the browser has a secure connection, whether it's HTTPS or secure socket layers. We set up different levels of encryption depending on what we're dealing with, different protocols to talk back and forth with websites or applications. And if we're doing this through the browser is managing that for us. And it manages our certificates. Now, it's not an easy thing to fake. And it's like I talked about previously, having a key at both ends, and what goes back and forth is secure. Others can't get it and get at it very easy. So I talked before about the updates, making sure that your OS is up to date. You've got to make sure that your browser's up to date because of the security aspects of it. Now, there's a concept called a proxy. And proxy, in a nutshell, is a stand-in. Let's say that there's an actor and they're in a movie, they've got a part in a movie, and all of a sudden there's a scene where they've got to jump out of an airplane and do something crazy. All right, I'm getting a proxy. I'm not doing this. I got somebody else that'll cover me for it. And that's essentially what a proxy is. Now, a proxy can be a server, it can be a device. It's just somebody acting in your stead. So I remember I worked overseas for years teaching grad school, and one of the countries that I was teaching in, Facebook was not allowed in the country, even though everybody used it. It wasn't allowed in the country. The only way I could access my Facebook account was through a proxy server. So I would interact with the proxy, and the proxy would interact with Facebook. And if anybody looked to see who I was talking to with my internet packets coming and going from my system, they would see that I was talking to another device, not the Facebook servers or whatever it may have been. So by putting that third party in between myself and the destination, it allows for a level of security, but at the same time, we could potentially run into a lower level of security, because the more that we have involved with this back and forth, it's more access points for somebody to get in and see what we're doing and keep track of what's going on. So we want to make sure that our proxy settings or proxy servers are all configured appropriately for whatever browser we're dealing with and whatever server that we're dealing with. Not a super complex scenario. We would go into internet options to go specify if we're dealing with a proxy server, and we can access that. Just go down to a search control panel, and that'll get us in there.
And we just have to point to it through our ISP. The ISP needs to know what the IP address is, or I should say, we've got to give the IP address to the connections tab. And it's just a matter of going in. They've got an example of it here. And do the same thing in Google Chrome. I talked before what a hash was when we talked about what's more secure, a short, complex password or a very long, very simple password. It all boils down to a very long, very simple is far more secure and complex because the hash becomes so much longer. So think of the hash as the key itself. So we generate a hash, and I have to see if I can find the video that I had, and I mentioned it in a previous lecture. A guy that writes the book on network security, Mark Champas. He's got a great video explaining password complexity and how easy it is to hack a hash. With the right computer, doesn't take long to figure out what a hash is on short passwords. But when that password starts getting long, it takes the computer a while to be able to hack it now. But when we're talking about the systems that we have available to us today, 10 core or more, these are fast devices. There's a lot more work going on than we really realize compared to what was taking place 10 years ago. Here's an example of what a hash looks like. Now, conceptually, if you're in the networking program, you'll deal with hashes in 2 or 3 security courses. So I talked before in a roundabout way about a VPN, it's a virtual private network. I like to compare it to, I remember years ago, I used to like movies about space and the space shuttle and astrophysics and things like that. We always talk about getting into a wormhole or a planet and another solar system is getting pulled into a black hole. And in a way, the wormholes that they talk about in those movies or in the different scenarios, it's kind of like what we're talking about when we deal with a VPN. It's kind of like, I don't see so much anymore, the drive-throughs. So I'll just pull up ATMs now, but old school drive-throughs where you would pull up and there'd be a little tube that went back and forth to send your deposit slip and whatnot. Those things were private tubes. Somebody may see the message going back and forth, but they don't know what that message is. And that's the concept behind a VPN. You create this encapsulated communication, tunneling, I like to call it. And what we end up doing is we encrypt everything that leaves and is coming back. So everything that goes between the destination and the origin, doesn't matter which direction, everything's encrypted. So the only way that you can understand or read what's being communicated is if you have the key. And the only one that has the key is the application at either end. It's all preset. And it's not like somebody else has that encryption key. So as long as we have this secure tunnel and everything that we send back and forth, nobody can get at it. They may see packets moving back and forth, but they can't read them. And even if they did access them, there's nothing, they couldn't do anything with them. So this idea of virtual private network, you may see commercials on TV about it lately. It's become a big deal. It's become a big deal because hackers are working very diligently. They're working really hard trying to access network communication. I just watched the news tonight before we started, and they were talking about local hospitals and data breaches. Those networks have been hacked. Now, if they were VPN networks, very difficult to hack. But for whatever reason, they weren't, and somehow somebody's accessed those systems. So we've got the VPN client, runs across the internet. There's a firewall, there's a VPN server, and then on the backside is this private network. Only way you can access it, you may get across the network, but unless you're getting through that firewall and getting through that VPN server, you're not accessing anything on the backside. So it's like you have this whole dotted line is that tunnel. You still got authenticated going through the firewall. That's a given. That's like the bouncer standing at the front door. But once you get through there, you still have this encryption, decryption taking place in there, along with authentication, everything else, because of the application that you're running to do what you got to do. Now, here it is, NordVPN. That's the commercial it seems like I'm seeing every time I turn around on TV lately. Popular VPN, install the software, and next thing you know, you've got it. You've got a secure connection to whatever it is. So if we were trying to connect remotely to our organization's network, this is how we would do it. It's how I have to do it to access resources at the college. I have to VPN into it. Aside from that, the only way I can access anything is accessing about the same things you access, just with different account permissions. I can access Workday, and access Canvas, and access the college website. But to access network resources, it's got to be in through VPN. That protects those resources to filter out the people that don't need access. Now, just having VPN will get you into the private network, but then you've got to have those credentials that we've talked about a few other lectures, whether it's group permissions, individual permissions, whatever it is. So that VPN gets you in, but you still have permissions that you're going to be required to
show to be able to access resources.
So it's a great way to protect an organization's network. It can get cumbersome at times.
At least it has for me. Files that you access exist there, and they really don't want you taking those files across the network and then saving them on your machine. They want you accessing them there, and they stay there. So it takes some getting used to. That's the best way to word it. Okay. So if we're going to set up a VPN, we've got to go in and set up a network connection, connect to a workplace, and click next. And we've got to tell it the IP address that we're going to connect to. And say it's a VPN connection. And then how are we going to connect to it? Whether it's a smart card, remember my credentials or not, allow other people to use this connection. That's an absolute no. And then we'll go ahead and create that connection. And there exists our connection to the other end. We've got to sign into it once. It's almost like any other back and forth logging into a system, but you're doing it through an application. Okay. So we end up creating the connection. When we see it just like it's another network connection in our network connections, it's no different than the Ethernet or Wi-Fi or whatever. This is its own kind of private network connection. So we can check to see how that's working, and that'll allow us to connect to a specific device, the device that we gave the IP address to. So really get a kick out of it. They keep coming up with these abbreviations now called wireless wide area network. So we've mentioned this in the past.
It's you having a router connected to internet access. That is your WWAN. Now, I can do it as a hotspot. I can create my own little hotspot. I can have a little USB AT&T device like they're showing here. There's a variety of different ways to connect to other devices or other networks. And depending on how we've got this set up, this one is essentially, it's actually quite big, but it's quite big because you're connecting to some ISP, probably over cell network, over AT&T cell network. So it's got to have a different kind of an antenna on there
to get that longer range. Most of the time, if you buy a new computer now, most of the new computers will come up with a small USB Wi-Fi connection, but it doesn't have a very long range. So that can be a big deal depending on where you're at, what you're doing. We've got to take that into consideration, both from the wireless access point
as well as from the client. We don't want the wireless access point to be broadcasting too far. I don't want somebody sitting out in the parking lot accessing my Wi-Fi, but at the same time, I want to make sure that all offices have access to it. But how we configure the network, that's a consideration here. With this, that's their access, and they've got their access through a cellular system. It's getting faster. Seems like every time I turn around, they're getting faster and faster connections over cellular. We can just plug in that antenna and we're connected. Now, I get a kick out of whenever I see metered connections in any of these textbooks anymore. All I can think about is Apple. And once you have reached a certain set data limit, we will throttle you back. But we're not going to tell you we're doing it until we get caught. Essentially, we want to go set metered connections. And it's not a bad thing. It's not like we're trying to be too controlling. But we've got to think about this. People that are using our network, what are they using it for? And it should be they're using it for work. And if they're using it for work, how much data throughput do they need for their work? Are they streaming videos, watching movies in their office? Is that the throughput that they need so bad? And that's a lot of throughput. Or are they gaming from their office? And we only have so much throughput available to the network. So if somebody's beating it up, we need to know who, how, why. And a lot of times we may want to go set a limit on everybody and find out, all right, who's exceeding the limit and why. So we set a limit on everybody, and then if somebody exceeds it, we'll set up an alert to where we get notified that they've exceeded it. And I don't want somebody connecting to our network and just bleeding it dry of everything that we're paying for network access, internet access. So we want to monitor what's taking place. Did a proof of concept a couple of years ago with Amazon Web Services for the server courses that I'm teaching. And AWS, Azure, and Google, all three, if you want to go set up virtual machines, you're paying by how much time you're running on the server and throughput. So it's a consumption thing. The more data you're consuming, the more you're going to have to pay. Well, if we look at things from that perspective, let's start putting limits on people so that you don't need all that data. Go ahead and throttle you back. And then if you do need more, we'll talk about it, find out why you need and what you need. So one of the things that comes with Win 10, Win 11, and the predecessors is Windows Defender. Just think about it like it's a security dog roaming the house, and it's aware of everything that happens at every window and every door in the house. That's Defender's job. Nothing can come and go without passing by or through Defender, the firewall. Now, Defender's a little more than a firewall, but just essentially we'll look at it as our personal firewall. So each one of these devices is running Defender. Now, here, they don't specifically say what it is, but it looks like a router or a wireless access. It's a router of some type. So we've got our router, our internal network. We've got a firewall between our router and the outside world. And then we have another firewall, and then we have the network. So one's a software firewall and one's a physical firewall. They're different. So one's running on a server that you've got to go through before you get out of their network. So this is their domain controller. So there's software version firewall, and then there's a physical firewall device. They're separate, distinct. Functionality is very similar. One's software running on the server, the other is software running on the device. These things can be really expensive, and they've got to be maintained, regularly updated. If you don't keep them updated, they're about worthless. So both of those are like, I worded it like a bouncer at the door, guard dog at the door. Nothing comes or goes without that device's approval. So we've got a lab. Go through and set it up. Okay, so conceptually, sometimes people have issues with this inbound and outbound control rule concept. Let's think about a bank. So a bank has inbound and outbound rules. And for you to leave, you can't just go walking out the door with a safety deposit box under your arm. Now, that's against the rules. So there's a security guard standing there at the door. And if that security guard saw you walking up to the front door with a safety deposit box under your arm, no. You're not leaving with that. And we're going to have to sit down and talk about this, but I've got a rule. You can't leave with that. And no, man, you can't leave with that desk office chair. And there's a variety of different things you can't leave with. But we've also got rules. No, you can't come in a Halloween suit and a bunny outfit. They got to be hard pressed when it comes to the face masks today with security at banks, because for the longest time they lose their mind if you came walking in with one on. All they think was we're getting robbed. So the firewall itself has settings for stuff coming in and stuff leaving. We don't want you taking out something you're not supposed to leave with. We don't want you coming in with something that's a threat. Oh, nope. You can't walk into this bank with AK-47, AR-15, whatever. So there's rules that are in place. We set the same thing on our firewall. EXEs being sent in, different things coming in, different types of software, different types of files, whatever it may be, we can go in and set different rules for that back and forth with the firewall. Now, when we're talking about Internet of Things, Internet of Things predominantly are those devices that we call IoT devices. They predominantly are connected to a network, whether it's peer-to-peer or a traditional LAN, WAN, whatever prefix we want to put in front of that AN. They have an IP address, so they're addressable. I can disconnect them and plug them back in anywhere else. It could be a static IP address and not a dynamic IP address, or it could be dynamic. It's however we want to configure it. But nonetheless, it's connected traditionally through a Wi-Fi connection. It may be solar powered, or it could be a long-term battery that is recharged ever so often. And the software wakes up, sends out data that's collected over time, and kind of goes back to sleep again for a while, and just wakes up, does what it has to do when it's got to do what it's got to do. Very low voltage, doesn't take a lot of electricity to do what they're doing. They could be plugged into electricity. And they don't have to worry about the battery aspect of it. But traditionally, they're wireless network connections. They could be Bluetooth connections. There's other connections that are, it's a different frequency, it's a different range. It's got a larger range than Bluetooth does, Z-Wave or Zigbee, and they can run 900 megahertz, 2.4 gigahertz, or like the Zigbee can run either or 900 or 2.4 gigahertz. The thing is, they can only reach so far. So we're talking about maybe the length of a football field. If it's a wide open stretch. Now, if we were talking about Wi-Fi, I don't know if we would have those same limitations, the length of the football field. It all depends on the transmitter, the antenna associated with the device, how far it could transmit and receive. The different types of connections they kind of open us up, because a lot of times when people create these IoT devices, they look at it like, well, this is proprietary, it's just for our organization, and we don't really have to worry about security because nobody else knows about it. And yet it's a bit naive to think that way, because if people know about it today, then a few more people are going to know about it in the short term, and eventually more people are going to find out about it, and then somebody at some point is going to wonder, I wonder if I can go access those things. I wonder what they are. I wonder how hard it'd be to get into those. And we talked about this before, the variety of different things, whether it's a thermostat, door locks, you've got Bluetooth and Wi-Fi phone, Bluetooth to Wi-Fi bridge or router, smart light bulbs, got my fish tank on there, got my irrigation on there. My brother's got his pool, all the equipment associated with his pool is an IoT device with an app. And he can connect to it anywhere with that app and see what's going on with that device and control that device. So we've heard about Ring being compromised. Ring is IoT. And a lot of how they're being compromised is through the company itself, former employees, or people that were familiar with that system through the developer. It's like I was just saying, we start out, well, we know about it, but nobody else knows about it. And it's the people that know, that circle grows. So next thing you know, somebody's looking to see what's going on outside your front door, or baby monitors, same deal. So there's things that we need to take into consideration. Those devices should be on a VPN. There's things that we don't want to have happen. We don't want to set up voice controls on stuff where somebody stood outside my office window and yelled loud enough to tell Alexa to unlock my front door. If I programmed my system to allow that to happen, and then somebody in that roundabout way accessed my system, we're just setting ourselves up. If we're going to set up, they say, a SOHO router, wireless access point, for the most part, they're all routers now. We need to think about what we've got going on behind the scenes on our network, and then how we're connecting to the outside world. So that's it's not our firewall, but it's our choke point when it comes to the network. I traditionally want to have a firewall on one side, the other, or both. I want to protect my network. If once we get in here, this is all my stuff, I want to make sure I've got my guard dog sitting there. I've got my bouncer waiting at the door. Nobody comes or goes without being authenticated. Check them, make sure that they're all legit. When we're talking about these wireless access points, some things to take into consideration are if you're running a DHCP system and not static IP addresses, if your DHCP server within that wireless access router, set it with a very short time to live on the IP address lease. Don't let somebody get an IP address and it's theirs as long as they want it. We've got to set encryption on it. We want to make sure the device itself is secure. A lot of times these devices will have the admin password written on the bottom of them from the factory. So if somebody goes into wherever this is, flips it up, takes a picture of it, and leaves, they can then go outside, hop on their laptop. They know the default IP address for this device, log into it, they got the password, and then it's game on. So we got to be real careful about where this is, who has access to it physically, and know all the connections and what's taking place with it. All right. So this page, they're talking about exactly what I was just saying. Make sure that people can access it, but at the same time, we want to make sure that it's at a reliable place to where in certain places, my son's old house had thick walls that for whatever reason, you get into certain rooms and there was no wireless in certain areas. So the wireless access point itself, we will set up an admin account, change the name of it. Don't use the default password. We've talked about that in the past. Change the name of the wireless access point to something else. Don't use your family name or things like that on it if it's at your house. What I joked before about would name mine FBI wireless or FBI surveillance van. People like, what? It's an access point for an FBI surveillance van. Crazy neighbor. So we're making things harder for people to access it. We can set times and days that we want to allow people to access. We can set time limits on them having access to our network. We can set data throughput limits, saw that. I think block individuals and block devices. And I need to choose whether I want static IP addresses or DHCP. And I also need to think about the wireless security protocol that we're going to deal with. Yeah. The device itself will have traditionally today a certain level of firewall settings associated with it. It's not like the firewalls we were just talking about, the software on your server or a standalone firewall. This thing's going to be updated as needed, and you really need to make sure these things stay updated, but it's going to check and see different ports, who's coming and going, and make sure that, yeah, you can only go in through this door. You're not going in through that door. And when I say door, they're the digital ports within the system. And we've touched on this in the past. If I'm dealing with POP or IMAP email servers, I'll deal with port 25. If I'm dealing with a web server, we'll deal with port 80. As these packets come in across the network, the firewall sees them, sees the application associated with them, and knows what port they need to go to. And I said, look, you're not going to any port other than 80 because of the way these packets are set up. If they're set up, if you've got the firewall configured in a way that certain ports are shut down, those packets come and they get rejected because we're not allowing any traffic through those ports. We can do port forwarding so that they come in and those packets only go to a certain machine. The others, yep, no, you're not getting those. So it can be a device that, yeah, that's where security's at, whatever it may be, but it's being monitored so that we're isolating what comes in and maybe filtering it in some way. So we can set that on the machine, set port forwarding. That's settings in our router and our firewall. And I can send that stuff over to a DMZ or a screened subnet that isn't protected. So once I can have a certain area that I don't want the stuff that is filtered going to, then once it's been inspected, then it can go end up over there at the DMZ. It's not an area that I really like to allow public access to, because once somebody gets in there, it could allow whoever got in there to get to the rest of the system itself. It's not something I care for too much. we may have content filtering, but content filtering is going to require documentation or certain criteria on what's allowed, what's not allowed. So there's got to be some rules that are already set up, call it a blacklist or a whitelist, things that you can access, and things you cannot access. But that's all got to be predetermined up front. So it's not like, oh, I'll just turn that on. And it's not that easy. Okay. So I may want to filter IP addresses to where I only allow certain IP addresses in and out. I may say, I don't want you accessing certain servers. So I go ahead and get the IP address for that server. No, you can't access it. Now that goes back to what I was talking about, the whole proxy thing when I was overseas. If I typed in youtube.com, or not YouTube, but facebook.com, it would come back as a, no, you can't access this. It was getting filtered. Proxy can get around. So the same ways that I can access my Facebook overseas, others can find ways around the filters. Port security. We want to lock down the ports when we're not using them and be very cautious about what's coming and going. It's like leaving a bunch of doors open on a building. We just don't want to have that lax of a security system. We'll lock down as much as we can. Now, every time I do this, it makes it hard for me to get back, but I think I can do it from here. So 802.11, that's 802.11. The 802.11 standard or protocol created by IEEE. Been a part of IEEE for decades. And IEEE is essentially electrical engineers, computer science techies that have joined together to standardize how we do things in computing. It focuses to a degree on networking, and they came up with these standards, the 802.11 standards. And the first one we started out with standard A, and it had a maximum speed, and it was a type of connectivity. The packets had to be created in a certain way, the way they're formatted, the way they're sent, everything about it had to adhere to that 802.11a standard. And if you did everything following that criteria, you could get up to 54 megabits per second. Now, compared to where we're at today, that's a snail's pace. They would come up with new protocols ever so often. And we're gotta have something beyond this. But at each one, we see how much they're advancing. Up to 54 megabits per second, up to 11. So this one's slower, but newer. And it had to deal with the frequency that we were dealing with and how far we could send things. So with 2.4 gigahertz, we're up to 100 meters, but we're not as fast. And then when they came out with G, we were just as fast and we were twice as far. And then it grew. When we got to N, that was significantly farther and faster. So we're over twice as far, and we were
12 times, 11 times faster. Now, these were coming out every few years. So this doesn't quite align with Moore's law. It's a little more stretched out than his time frame. But he says it's doubling every so often. So yeah, we're not far off from there. We've doubled in distance. And then we're more than doubling in speed, and we're stretching out the distance as well. What we've gotten up to today. What's faster? Cat 6 or 802.11ax Wi-Fi? Well, search. Cat 6.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it depends on what Cat 6 cable you're using, right?
Yeah. So we could be, in theory, 10 gigabits per second, but come back here, well, potentially we're about the same. So it's all about the protocol. If we're talking about Wi-Fi, the protocol we're following, and the cabling itself. I had a class 2 weeks ago now that one of the hardware identification things they had to do was, is that a Cat 5 cable? And it looked like a Cat 5 cable, but when you looked at the outer sheathing, you could see that it was a Cat 6 cable because it was written right on it. Now, if we didn't know that, if we couldn't read that, we have to assume the worst and that it's Cat 5, and we're not going to get anywhere near 10 gig out of it. Not that we're necessarily going to get 10 gig out of 802.11ax. There's a caveat on all of these, and that is the system is only as fast as its slowest component. And a lot of times what that could mean is that if I've got an 802.11ax device, you can only connect to it and get those high speeds with an 802.11ax device. So both ends, sender and receiver, both have to be 802.11ax. If, let's say I had an 802.11n and I connect to this, all I'm getting is 802.11n. And depending on the manufacturer, what's happened in the past, I remember going to my brother's house one time. He had 802.11n, and I had an 802.11g phone. And I said, hey, what's your Wi-Fi password? He says, what are you connecting with? I said, my phone. He said, I'm not going to give it to you. What do you mean you're not going to give it to me? He says, if you connect to my adapter, it's going to throttle everything that's connected back to 802.11g. So if I had an 802.11n wireless access port, I could get 600 megabits per second. But if somebody with 802.11g connected to it, by default, that whole thing treats every connection like it's 802.11g, and that's as fast as anybody would connect to it, even though it was an 802.11 device. It's slowed down. It's almost like having slow traffic ahead of you. That's as fast as they can go. Now, it may not be the case with a lot of devices today because it was just a ridiculous concept that everybody else has to go as slow as that one device. We've got to understand that if they're manufacturing 802.11ax devices today, it's going to be around for a few years. say it's a viable protocol for at least 5-6 years. But there's going to be something else 4 or 5 years from now. If they had just came out with 802.11ax, 4 or 5 years from now, you're going to hear about what's next. And it'll be significant. These changes are not, I mean, look at the changes, they're not half steps. AC was theoretical up to 7. It you wouldn't expect more than about 1 1/4, and that's it. But when all things, or I've heard people say, when the stars are aligned, you can get 7. Yeah, it won't happen in my lifetime. Won't happen with my devices. It's just in a perfect world. Or I should say, on paper, they could get 7. Well, that's on paper, but we're dealing digitally and not on paper. So we've got to require a security key to connect to your network. Make sure that you set it with a high encryption protocol, not something slouchy like WEP. Select the channels that you're going to deal with, because the channels will dictate how far the signal will go. And that's what we just saw back here when we were looking at it. That difference between 5 gigahertz and 2.4 gigahertz is significant difference distance-wise. So we got to look at the channels that we're dealing with. If distance isn't that big a deal, try a different channel. Got to think about how many connections we've got as well. I don't allow guest access on any of my devices anymore because I don't want anybody sniffing around in there. Like I said, here's different encryption protocols. I want to use the strictest that I can without running into problems with connectivity for users that I want to have access to. Now, in a nutshell, here's a great example of that. I've got a printer. I don't want to say the manufacturer because I just despise the manufacturer now that I bought this printer. Depending on the encryption, my printer will or will not work. So if I set my encryption on my wireless network at the house very high, and that's a wireless network printer, it won't work on the high level security. That's what I get for not wanting to spend a lot of money on a printer. So we've got to understand that with higher level security, there's a cost associated with it. With lower level security, there's a cost associated with it. So we pick what's best for us and go with it. We've got other types of authentication services if we're dealing with if we're dealing with an enterprise, let's say big organization. I may have a Radius server, may have terminal access if I'm dealing with Cisco products, Kerberos, I may be dealing with that as well as Radius. Each one is going to be allowing access traditionally, going back and forth with Active Directory. So that's something to deal with more in CET 27, I think 93. It's either 93 or 94.
All right.
So if I want to deal with remote access, and I'm real cautious about who I give remote access to. If somebody gets remote access to your computer, they can do whatever they want. So if you're connecting, say you're talking to a help desk somewhere, and you give them access to your computer, they have the ability to install software without you even realizing what just took place. Take over all of it, and you don't even realize what was happening in the background. So I'm real apprehensive about who I allow remote access to. We can do in different connections, whether it's Teams, I can go in and remote somebody else's computer. Not sure if I can do it in Zoom. I don't think I can do it in Zoom. I can share my screen where y'all can see it. But remote access is somebody else actually is able to get in and do things to my computer from theirs. So it's very risky. Now, we deal with FTP, but we don't really realize what's taking place. FTP has become so much more than what it was 10, 15 years ago. So if we're dealing with OneDrive or Dropbox or Box or Google Drive and any of these online storage, it's using the FTP protocol, got a specific port that it goes in and out of, and it's connecting your device to some drive that is storing your documents, folders, whatever it may be. Now, this has to be synced. It's got to maintain synchronization, and it's got to be updated on a regular basis to make sure that everything that is on your device is the same as what's on Dropbox or Google Drive, whatever it may be. So down in the bottom corner of my device, I've got 2 OneDrive clouds that currently one of them I'm signed into, the other one I'm not. One's blue, I'm signed in, and I'm all up to date. The other one looks like a gray cloud with a line through it. I'm not signed in, it doesn't even know if I'm up to date right now. Now, these connections are dealing with 2 ports, port 20 and port 21, and that is that door, if you will, that all the files are coming and going from. The firewall checks everything coming and going through. So everything that comes out of that port goes through the firewall, goes in that port on the other end, goes through their firewall, or through their firewall and then their port. It can only go through that port. It's not like you can FTP into port 80. It doesn't work that way. We've got software now that's in Win 10 and 11 that allows you to use the RDP protocol to connect to your desktop remotely. It's running through another port, it's 3389. Now, with this, call it remote desktop, and I can go connect to another device. That lab that I've talked about a number of times in Lake Worth, when I want to connect to the domain controller from my device or any of the devices on the network, I RDP into it. And I'll go in and I'll essentially just go down to the sit down at the bottom, type here to search, come down here, it might popped up on a different window, but I click on that and say remote desktop, pops up, and then I just tell it, what do I want to connect to? And I've got to give it an IP address of where I'm going to connect to, and it's got to actually have it enabled to be able to do it. But here they're enabling it, and here it is. What I do my search, and this will pop up. Computer I want to connect to remotely. Connect. Then the next thing that'll come up, I've got to log in, and so I've logged in. I can see that device, the desktop from that device on my screen. And I'm accessing it essentially through what appears to be a browser screen of sorts. And I just remote into it. So here's log in. And there it is. It almost looks like a browser screen, but it's the same kind of screen that you see in those virtual machine labs. Looks like a little virtual machine because it is. That machine is running virtually on your device, but you're just seeing that front end interface. That's all that's running on your machine. Everything else is running at the destination. So you can pull up that desktop wherever you want. You can drill down into whatever access you want to get into. And if this one's a desktop of a desktop app, not a server side app, I could log into a server same way. Remote access into it. Now, there was a lot that took place for me to get to it, but once I've got it configured, it's easy to get to. I go put a shortcut on the desktop, click it. It comes up to the connection. I verify the IP address, click it. Next thing I'm hit my username and password, and then here I am. Whether it's a client machine or server machine, it's whatever I want to remote to. As long as they're both configured, I'm all good. Right. Microsoft has the same thing where they will help you with your computer using the same technology. Now, I prefer that they only do it when I allow them to do it. It's kind of sketchy when you've got somebody that has that kind of ability to connect to your device and go in and do whatever they want to it. Right. So we can go in and do remote assistance and say, hey, can somebody come help me? So talk about virtual network computing, and that's what I was talking about with this remote desktop to a degree, but there's other ways to go about it now. And what we'll do today is not only today in this class, but today, traditionally in business, we'll have a virtual machine running on a server. And then I just connect to it remotely. And everything's virtual. And if something bad happens to it, it wasn't the whole machine, it was just that little virtual machine. So in Windows 10, I can run Linux, Unix, run Android or not. I can run all kinds of Windows machines on Hyper-V. I can run virtual machines on a Mac, have a virtual Windows 10 machine on a Mac. And a lot of times we used to call it emulation. It looks like a Windows machine, but you're actually running on Mac. It looks like the other devices, but they're actually running on whatever it may be. Why would we want to do that? Well, there's certain security aspects. It's running virtually. If somebody hacked that device and it was virtual,
I can shut that thing down really fast and spin it back up really fast. Virtual machines can go down and come back up a whole lot faster than traditional devices.
Let's see. So they're dealing with secure shell connections, or SSH protocol. It's connecting two devices. And essentially all we're doing is the connection between the two devices uses an encryption key. That's as simple as that. Contact the server. This is who I am. Create the connection back and forth, and then everything going back and forth will use the SSH keys back and forth. I think I mentioned something along those lines with emails, submissions that I used to have to do for a security class I took in grad course that I was taking years ago. So I can not just control devices remotely, but I can monitor and manage those devices remotely. So I can have these devices just about anywhere I want, and I don't have to be there. I can remote access into it, see what's going on with it. Physically, nobody can access it. As long as I have it in a good, clean, cool environment, uninterrupted power supplies, golden. And if I had it set up in a RAID or something like that, multiple devices, redundancy, something happens to one, oh good, I still have another one going. Drive fails, no worries, I've got others that still have the same data on it. So there's so much that I can do remotely. But I've just got to be real careful about all this stuff being remotely. A lot of times what we'll do is say, well, I'll create some, I shouldn't say create some, I'll use some third-party tool to take care of that for me. And every time we connect these third-party tools are using other ports. They've got to have a port open to do whatever they've got to do. And so for remote desktop, you've got to have 3389. That's an issue. It's a security issue. And then if we're talking about TeamViewer or a Citrix product, go to my PC, log me in, there's Zoom. All these things we've got to worry about who's controlling the connection to those systems, who's controlling that. Can Zoom just access my system whenever they want because I've installed it and opened that port up for it? So first and foremost, we got to be able to troubleshoot what's taking place on the network, troubleshoot the network connections. Got the program files, we can go look in there, get in the command line tool. It's cumbersome, and it's beyond a lot of it, at least at this point. Can go in and I can ping the target. I go and check and see what my internet settings are. Go in ipconfig/all. I go trying to see, can I actually ping whatever it is I'm trying to get a hold of? And if I do have a decent time to live, I'm getting responses. Okay, I'm talking to that device, so it's not the network connection. What else could it be? Now, there's a host name, and the command line displays the host name. And I was hoping they'd show. So if I wanted to go see all of the IP configuration settings,
what your physical address is. Some older devices, they'll call that the MAC address. And I'm not calling it MAC address anymore, they're calling it a physical address. We see what my IP address is, DNS servers, DHCP server, the lease, who I got my lease from my IP address, how long it's going to live before it expires. There's so much that I can see relative to
the network configuration. There's command line commands for me to be able to go through and deal with these things. Most of the time, I'll just go in and reset the connection or disable a connection, enable a connection, go into connection manager, network connection manager,
and turn it off, turn it back on. And when it does that, goes grabs another IP address. Each of these we can go through and run in a command prompt
and deal with whatever's going on, trying to resolve IP addressing issues or DNS issues. Now, if I'm running namespace lookup or name server lookup, it'll tell me the DNS server that I'm dealing with, my IP address, who I'm connected to, the name of the server, all that stuff's going to come up and it'll tell me what's going on. That can help me know who I'm connected to. Tracert is another command line tool. It allows me to find out what it's taking for me to get from the point of origin to the destination. So it's how many hops along the way to get from my machine to, similar to pinging, but we're finding out what's it taking to get there. It's almost like saying, all right, you're going to Orlando, but how many cities are you going through? That's what Tracert will do. It'll go trace that route and see where did you go, what it take to get there, how long did it take you to get from one to the next. And they show it here. So we went to this device, went to this device, and here's how long it took to get the maximum number of hops to get. It's just finding the path from point A to point B. So path ping is a combination between ping and Tracert. It checks to see, can we get where we need to get to? We've got different net commands, and this is all stuff that we predominantly use in CNT 2000. So NetStacks is network statistics, and let us know what's going on with the different parameters on the device. So netstat-b lists the programs that are using the connection. So if there are programs that are actually using your IP address, what are they talking to? So it'll go through and it'll tell us the application, what they're talking to, and what kind of connection it is. Is it established connection, or what kind of connection was it? This one, for those that don't have a whole lot of experience with command line, I think there's a lab or two in this chapter that can be challenging. So ask questions when you have them, and let's go from there. So